Hi guys. Today we're going to talk about sustainable beekeeping in the IPM Pyramid. And thanks for joining me. If I speak a little funny, I'm going to explain to you why in a second. I don't have a Texas accent, but let me share my screen first so that I can share my slides with you and present. There we go. Here we go. So we're going to talk about sustainable beekeeping in the IPM pyramid, or how chemical-free interventions are enough for troubleshooting as a general rule. I'm with Be Mindful, and that's my company's, and Les Crowder is my business partner there. My name is Nathalie Biggie, and I've been in the US for about 25 years. Like I said, I'm French, which is why I'm speaking a little funny. I don't have a Texan accent. And I came to the United States about 26 years ago for my MBA at Ohio State. And I never really left after that. I started working for corporate, for technology companies, doing project management. And after a while, I got tired of that. So I stopped and launched my own company, which was teaching French conversation to adults and kids. And about 6 years ago, I got my first beehive, a water hive. And it was love at first sight. So I never looked back and started my company called Be Mindful, which is a natural beekeeping company. We're actually treatment free. And I also created the Hayes County Beekeepers Association, which is also a treatment free beekeeping group around Austin. And I was the president and I'm the vice president of HCBA, and I'm also the past vice president of Travis County Beekeepers Association. And I'm in the Texas A&M Master Beekeeper Program at the advanced level. Here you go. This kind of a stuff that you get. You can put a patch that you can put on your bee suit when you're in the program. And so I even was hired by the Congolese government for professional training to design and lead their countrywide beekeeping training program for the trade schools, as a way to provide rural communities with a dignified source of income and of food security. And I work, like I said, with Les Crowder, who needs no introduction, but just in case. He's been beekeeping for over 55 years. He's a natural treatment-free beekeeper as well, specialized in topper hives now, but he's kept all kinds of beehives throughout his career. He was the inspector for the state of New Mexico, a beekeeping inspector, and he's a biologist, and he wrote the book called Top Bar Beekeeping, Organic Practices for Honeybee Health. He's got a lot of wisdom, and I'm grateful to have him as a mentor and as a friend and as a business partner. So that's a little bit about us. This is where you can contact us, our business card. As you see at the bottom, the website is be-mindful.com. And the the email address is bemindfulhoneyfarms@gmail.com. So if you have questions, and I'll post that again at the end of the presentation for you to see. So let's take a look at first failure rates comparisons. It's basically, we're going to talk about that, IPM definition, why IPM, the underlying premises, the various levels of IPM, and how IPM is for chemical-free troubleshooting is considered to be a best practices for natural beekeeping. I'm pushing the wrong button. Failure rate comparisons. So keep in mind throughout this conversation that in wild colonies, the ones that are not managed by human beekeepers, the failure rate in the first year for a wild colony is about 75%. So that's pretty high. And then after that, once they've overwintered and survived their first year, the failure rate is about 18%. And the corollary is that the survival rate is about 80%. And when it comes to managed colonies, the winter failure rates are actually anywhere between, some people will be lower, some people will be higher, but on average between 30 to 70%. I know we don't get to that level we have really high winter survival rates in our apiaries. And that's because we keep very strong and healthy colonies, and we have not lost colonies to Varroa mites or overwintering hardly in a long time. It happens occasionally, but our rates are actually a lot lower than that. But on average, they're about 30 to 70%. And for established wild colonies, nature averages are about 5 to 6 years on average for a mean lifespan, as well as 90% chance of having a queen turnover, meaning swarming, each summer. So they go through swarming through at least once a year on average. And they tend to live in smaller cavities, which also promotes the swarming behavior. And that goes to say that within the natural context, and without beekeepers trying to prevent them from swarming for their own purposes, the colonies will swarm and basically experience brood breaks fairly regularly throughout the seasons. So that that's kind of one way for them to control their pests and pathogens. And they might not produce as much honey, but they will produce enough for themselves. And in that case, that's all that matters to them. So what's IPM? IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management, and it's got several levels, mostly chemical, biological, physical, and cultural. And what it is, it's basically a pest management strategy. There's IPM guidelines for all kinds of livestock that are man-managed. And that strategy integrates a combination of tactics and approaches that aim to reduce the population of pests, while at the same time decreasing the impact that those pests and pathogens might have on the health of the organism. And the strategy is trying to do that as non-intrusively and as effectively as possible, meaning first do no harm and try, the least intrusive and costly interventions first before you go and increase that intervention if the problem is still not resolved. So why IPM? Well, the core reasons, and that's true throughout the different types of livestock management and husbandries. The core reasons is that for beekeeping in particular, but in general, there's an abundance and there's a decline in the abundance of and diversity of our pollinators. There's also a lot more wax contamination and colony damage that's created by various factors. And there's also an increasing resistance to treatments of all kinds. So that's why IPM was created, is to try to mitigate some of that. In particular, mitigate pesticides around in the environment, as well as acaricides in the colonies, and the loss of forage, which are huge stressors and take a toll on honeybee colony health. And another goal of IPM is to mitigate the systematic, prophylactic, scheduled blanket use of treatments. A lot of beekeepers tend to start with treatments and consider that they have to treat their bees or their colonies will die, which is not true. And that's not what IPM recommends either. Those should be kept for last resort, if any. The other goal is to decrease the comorbidity factors, such as poor beekeeping practices. A lot of beekeepers don't have the best beekeeping practices, and that negatively impacts the colony, stressing it and not allowing them to troubleshoot as needed. Also, another factor that comes into play is stress and the resulting weakened immune system that can be because of parasites, because of pathogens like viruses or bacteria. That can also be because of poor nutrition. There's not enough forage or it's poor quality. That can also be through weather. If the weather is too harsh, whether it's too hot or too cold, that weakens the immune system of the colony. And also another factor would be in hive toxins, such as some of the pesticides that might be applied by us, or some that are accumulated from bees going out and foraging and bringing them back into the hive, as well as things like several generations of cocoons, which are going to be encased by propolis, but after a while they accumulate a lot of toxins and will need to be called out to maintain a healthy colony. Another big one that's often forgotten is inbreeding depression. So a lot of the bees in the United States have a tendency to be inbred, and that breeds depression, as opposed to diversity and vigor that's resulting from that diversity. So keep that in mind as we go through the steps. So the underlying bed of the IPM, the premises of IPM, is that as beekeepers and as troubleshooters, we need to really well understand the life cycles, both of the honeybee itself as an individual, but also as of the colony as a whole. Honeybees will go through developmental stages. They'll start as an egg, turn into a larvae, get capped and turn into a pupae and an imago, and will emerge as a fully formed adult that will go through several stages of maturation and body function. And the colony also at a meta level, at the superorganism level, will go through cycles, mostly based on the seasons, where in the spring it will start increasing and leverage the workforce increases to harvest food in higher quantities in provision of the dearth and the cooler months in our climates. And so there's two levels. There's the individual level, and then there's the colony level. And IPM requires that we understand, as beekeepers, we understand both cycles, life cycles, that of the bees and that of the colonies, for better understanding and troubleshooting purposes. It also requires that we are able, as beekeepers, to recognize the developing problems early enough so we can intervene early enough before the problems get too bad. It has to be done in timely fashion, or things can get out of hand and you have to escalate the levels of intervention at that point. Also, it's important for beekeepers to realize that complete eradication, elimination of common pests and pathogens is rarely possible, but you might end up having a coexistence between those pests and pathogens and your colonies. And as long as they're not showing signs of stress and they're thriving, it doesn't mean that you have to intervene unless there's signs that it's getting bad. The other thing that beekeepers need to understand in the context of IPM is that treatments are to be avoided in order to delay pesticide resistance. And eventually all treatments, all chemicals will induce some level of pesticide resistance within the pest population. And that's true even of the organic acids. There's some signs that are showing already a certain level of resistance where the mites are starting to develop coping mechanisms after being exposed too much to those. And then beekeepers need to also understand that a colony has got a biome, a symbiotic microbial and yeast relationship within the colony that is impacting, things like individual bee gut, and as a whole might end up playing on the health of the entire colony. And if just like so I don't like to anthropomorphize, but as a superorganism, at the superorganism level, the colony has an immune system that may be negatively affected by things like medication or environmental pesticides, just like our immune system, our gut is being negatively impacted by those as well. So we need to understand all this to really understand how the integrated pest management works. And the best way to remember and understand how this works and what needs to be done in which order is to look at the integrated pest management as a pyramid. And that pyramid has, in the case of the honeybee superorganism, it can consider to be having 5 levels. Most literature will call for 4, but really if you look at a little bit better, deeper, you need to be able to also identify and understand the pests of the honeybee colonies, and that constitutes in itself another step, so a 5th step. And the IPM pyramid is aimed to prevent problems rather than intervene after the problems arise. And we're going to talk about this. So 5 levels. The first one at the bottom is going to be identification and understanding of pests and pathogens. The one above will be cultural controls and sanitation, and we'll talk about that. Next one above that is going to be physical and mechanical interventions to prevent or curb issues with pests and pathogens. And then above that, after break line, because we usually don't go above that line, at least to be mindful, and we don't recommend you do either, is the biological level, and then above that, the chemical level. So let's dig into that a little bit. So the first level of the IPM pyramid, as mentioned, was the identification and understanding of pests and pathogens. That means basically understanding the biology and the life cycle of each of the pests and pathogens that are found within the colony, so that you can better understand how to disrupt its cycle and its reproduction, and thereby limit the damage it may cause, the impact it has on the colonies. And for that level, that means more specifically things like understanding how a healthy colony of honeybees looks and behave when it's healthy, right? What are the cycles that we just talked about at the individual and at the colony level? What do they look like when they're normal? What does the brood pattern look like? What does a thriving colony looks like? Do they have like a lot of food? Do they follow the seasons? Do they contract in the dearth and expand in the flows? All the things that bees do at the individual level and at the colony level need to be understood. The next step in that, the other aspect, the other facet of this level would be for the beekeeper to understand the main pests and pathogens. That's that identification and understanding again, where we need to really, for each of the major pests and pathogens, we need to be able to understand their life cycle and learn to identify the symptoms. So it's not good enough to know what the cycles are for varroa mites, the cycles of reproduction. But if we don't understand what the signs are of a heavy infestation or a problem that's triggered by a heavy infestation or a weakened immune system, then understanding their life cycle is not going to help us. We need to be able to spot it too. And the reason for that is because we want to be able to intervene in a timely fashion before problems become actually significant and require additional level of intervention that can get more and more toxic as we go. So, for example, these two pictures show on the left a healthy brood pattern and something, where the queen has laid really tightly. There's very few cells that have been missed, that are not capped. And it looks really tight and healthy. It's plentiful. And so I would say this colony is in full expansion and it looks healthy enough to do so very efficiently. And the queen is probably really good and well mated and healthy. On the other hand, the picture on the right is showing a fairly spotty brood pattern, which is usually the sign of either heavy inbreeding or a poor queen, or sometimes also of a Varroa infestation and lack of immune response that's adequate to it. So identification would be anything that's allowing you to assess if a colony is healthy or if it's failing to thrive. If your colony is just pittering along versus booming and expanding and looking strong, those are signs that you can use to identify the problems. And also you need to actually be able to also identify the pests and pathogens themselves, not just the impact they have on the colony, as well as evaluate their levels of infestation. Along with that comes understanding. That means knowing how to read the combs, like we just looked at those two frames and realized one on the left was looking really healthy for multiple reasons versus the one on the right. That's knowing how to read the comb. How much resources is there in the combs? How many babies are there? Is it a good time of the year for them to be showing those signs? Are there any signs of disease? And then understanding the life cycle and symptoms of the pests and pathogens, and not just being able to spot the signs. Okay, so I'm going to give you two major examples with two of the, at least one of the most impactful pests that honeybee colonies have since their invasion from Asian honeybees a few years back. And if you look at, and it's Varroa mites, so Varroa Destructor. And on the left, the top picture is showing, again, a really spotty brood pattern. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. So you want to know the life cycle of this pest, and so you want to be able to realize that the mother mite is going to get into the larvae just before it gets capped, and once it's there, it's going to start laying eggs, first a male and then females every, I think it's 13 hours after that, one female each, and those are going to mature and they're going to mate with the male in the cell, and they're going to be ready to emerge with the bee once the cycle is complete, and then they'll be leaving the cells on the back of adult bees that have emerged, and the cycle will start over. So understanding that cycle plus the one at the bottom right here on the right side. So the one at the top was at the individual level. The one at the bottom is at the colony level. So that means understanding that in the dormant phase, there's not a lot of mites, that's the orange line, because there's not a lot of brood for them to reproduce. Remember, they need that stage, that brood stage, for them to reproduce. And as the colony grows throughout the onset of the nectar flow, so does slowly the population of Varroa mites. However, they don't grow as fast as the population of the honeybees in the spring. So the population of honeybees will peak in the summer at the end of the nectar flow and start dipping down really fast throughout the winter. The problem arises when the mites continue to grow after the population has peaked for the honeybees, and they end up really surpassing the population of honeybees and having a concentration of infestation that increases tremendously in the fall and winter, and in some cases in weak colonies will induce crashing of the colony. So both at the individual level and at the colony superorganism level, you need to understand their life cycle. You also need to understand their signs, their symptoms. In this case, things like, and it's usually a combination of symptoms. It's hard to give a diagnosis with just one symptom, like this famous deformed wing virus. If you have several deformed wing virus in your colony, then you have a problem probably with varroa mites. If you have just one and the colony looks otherwise healthy, maybe not. Maybe it's just kind of one bee whose immune system failed her and she's expressed that pathogens, but the rest of the colony is doing well. So you have to be able to assess that and make sure you understand all the playing factors in there. Another symptom of a varroa infestation is obviously finding mites on the larvae. When you uncap them and pull them out, their metamorphosis hasn't been completed, but as you pull them out, you'll see multiple individuals of mites. And sometimes you might even see them on the adult bees. And if you see a lot of mites on adult bees, you know that your infestation level is already pretty high, and you have a problem at that point. Another sign of a varroa mite infestation is a spotty brood pattern. And again, varroa mites are not the only cause of a spotty brood pattern. There's also inbreeding and backfilling of the brood's nests and poor laying queen are all symptoms of PMS, poor brood pattern. So, but in the case of varroa mites, that can happen as well, as the mites are overcoming the immune system of the colony, and the brood is getting sick and pulled out by hygienic behavior from the bees, which ends up giving you a really ugly pattern as they've cleaned up the house in too many cells. So let's see. What can we see on this picture? Does it look good? This is part of that reading your brood pattern, your brood frames, and learning to identify symptoms of an issue. Well, if you look a little bit closely, there's several things that I'm looking at that have got me worried a little bit. So for example, there's a bunch of larvae that are looking highly unhealthy or having issues. And here those are. That first one right here, second. And there we go. So some of these have been chewed up by mites. Some of them are looking really sick and kind of melty, discolored. One of them has been uncapped, probably because they could smell the mites underneath, or we're trying to get them out. So the thing is that when the cell is uncapped, the mites don't survive usually, the ones that are not mature. And there's another bigger issue. It's an issue in combination with all the other symptoms, as well as the quantity of potentially that one being represented. And it's this little guy there. As you can see, she's got the deformed wing virus as well. So she can't fly, she can't provide any kind of benefit to the colony. She will never be a forager that's going to bring back enough food. So if too many bees are expressing this disease, excuse me, then you're going to end up having a colony that's not going to be able to sustain itself, and that becomes an issue. So this is basically what PMS looks like, and PMS is an acronym that means parasitic mite syndrome. And once you've got that, and this obviously, it's probably a bit too late for your colony to turn the corner and make it back. So you want to really have a keen eye and start identifying any of these issues early on, and make sure you give some opportunities for the colonies to cleanse themselves from those pests and pathogens. And in particular, I'm thinking about brood breaks as a way to. A lot of the pests and pathogens are actually diseases of the brood, and when there's no brood in the colony, either in the dearth or because you've removed the queen, or because you've done a shakedown and just kind of caught a swarm or anything like that, then the pests and pathogens is kind of stalled. It stops its life cycle, and it's going to have to wait until there's more brood to resume the life cycle in question. So it's kind of a way to control the levels. There we go. Another culprit is another pest of the colonies that is well known and that can sometimes cause issues is the small hive beetles. Bees haven't co-evolved with them either, and they can sometimes take over the colony when resources are not well protected by a layer of bees everywhere. And in this first picture, you might be able to see, well, actually, let's go through the life cycle again. Let's be consistent. And so basically the way this works is adult beetles will enter the hive through the front door, especially if it's wide open, they'll just fly right in. And then they'll hide in corners and cracks and crevices, even beg some food from the bees, and start laying eggs in areas where the bees are not really able to contain them, and or into honey frames or pollen frames, and even in brood combs, because they are looking for protein and a little bit of energy as well, but mostly protein. And then they'll start laying their eggs, and those will hatch, and then you'll have a bunch of larvae like that wriggling around in your colony. And especially on those honey frames, they will slime that honey and it will not be fit for human consumption. However, the bees will love to rob that out if you leave it somewhere away from your hives. But once that's done, those larvae promptly get out of the hive through the front door again. They'll drop to the ground and they'll go dig and pupate into the ground to transform into a fully adult hive beetle. So understanding this life cycle is very important because it might provide you clues as to how you can interrupt that life cycle and curb the expansion of that pest. So in the case of small hive beetles, some of the signs are, again, that slimed honey is a dead giveaway. It also smells quite fermented, depending on the infestation level. And then this is what it looked like. They're a lot smaller, obviously, so you might need some reading glasses or some magnifying glass to be able to see them to that level. And once these have pupated into the ground and return to the hive as an adult, they might, their numbers might increase, and you might end up having an infestation that sometimes becomes so unbearable to the bees that they will abscond and just say, nope, that's unsat, we're out of there. But usually up to 20, 30 is not that big of an issue. Some colonies actually do well with even more than that. But as a general rule, it's best if you can keep it at bay, not necessarily by your active interventions, but by enabling the bees to take care of that. Oops, okay. So that was identification and understanding of pests. The next level, level number 2, is going to be cultural controls and sanitation. And that means things like, and we're going to go through that, but not importing queens from other states or other regions that have a completely different climate, and making sure your colonies and your bees have adequate and plentiful nutrition. So what can you do as a beekeeper to intervene at that level? Well, the first and most important thing that you can do is to use good queens. And when I mean good queens, I mean very specifically using and requeening with locally bred, resilient, untreated survivor stock. Because chances are that if it's it's going to be adapted to the cycles of weather and forage in your area, and it's going to be tolerant of the mites, for example, and resistant to the viruses that they transmit, because they're just basically a back alley cat that's got a really strong, fighting chance against those. The other thing is, for a good queen, you also need to have what we talked about earlier. You need to leverage hybrid vigor and over inbreeding depression. And what that means is that you can't keep, like a lot of queen breeders will keep reusing same queens from year to year, or the daughters of those queens, the same lines of bees. The same bees get brought over from Hawaii, the same bees get used, Saskatraz or Russians or whatever, and people swear by those, And that ends up breeding depression because there's a lack of diversity in the pool of genetics at that point. So by collecting swarms and cutouts and bees in the wild and bringing bees from different characters that have different characteristics, you're increasing the level of diversity and therefore instilling vigor into your colonies. And again, a spotty brood pattern is very often a sign of inbreeding depression, so keep that in mind. I like to say that the varroa mites are actually a symptom of a bigger problem, usually at the queen level. The other thing that can go wrong with a queen is that they can be poorly fed as a larvae, which means that they're going to not be as good quality, not as well mated, and that's going to impact negatively the colonies that they're going to head out, that they're going to head. And so you want well-fed, well-mated queens that are well established. So we talked about well-fed. Well-mated means that she's mated with enough drones to bring in diversity and vigor. And well-established queens, that means that they have had at least a couple of weeks as laying queens before they get harvested and shipped out or sold, so that their reproductive system has time to mature and settle into its new constant laying role. So what happens is very often puppy mill queen breeders will pump out those queens so fast, and they have so many customers that they are not giving the newly mated queens time to lay into a colony for a couple of weeks. They'll see first sign of an egg or egg laying, they will harvest those, cage them, and then ship them to beekeepers, which is going to introduce a break into their laying every day, and that's going to negatively impact the establishment of their reproductive system and therefore the entire colony. The other thing, so the queens, that's super important. And then the next thing that we can do for cultural controls and sanitation is to avoid cross-contamination. Sanitation, keep it clean. If you're in theory, you should not swap frames between colonies. You should not swap colonies between apiaries. You should not play musical colonies or musical frames between colonies. And then you should clean your tools and your gloves, especially if you see signs of diseases. So keep in a clean environment, especially if you see signs of disease. The other thing you can do is cull your old comb, because that's going to accumulate more and more toxins, and it's going to take a higher and higher toll on the colony's immune system when you've got old comb filled with several layers of cocoons. And as you know, a larvae will defecate before it spins its cocoon, and then the nurse bees will come in and clean that cell once they've emerged, and they will put a layer of propolis over that cocoon and feces, and so on and so forth. So that accumulates, the cells get smaller, and it gets more stressful for the colony to maintain those combs. They become almost toxic. The other thing you can do is to provide the colonies the opportunity to raise their brood on natural comb or natural cells. So natural comb is very important. It's a communication highway. It stores pheromone messages, and it's just kind of like holds the memory of the colony as well. And through vibration, it's allowing bees to communicate about where food sources are. So it's critical in dampening that natural comb with a rigid foundation is going to take a toll on your colonies, a negative impact, because they won't be able to communicate as effectively. The other thing that you can do for cultural control and sanitation is provide brood breaks, whether they be through like a brood break from a split, that you're going to have to wait for a new queen to be mated and come back and head out that split, or through removing the queen, or letting your bees swarm, or hold the queen for a while in a cage. You can cage her in her own colony. That'll keep it queen right, but the brood will have time to emerge and provide a brood break. The other thing you want to do is control the levels of stress. And levels of stress are caused by poor nutrition. As you can see on those bees on the right, the fat one is the happy one. And so you want to make sure that your colonies have good food available in quantity and quality that's going to satisfy their needs for their babies. That is not contaminated by pesticides or acaricides. You don't want also to treat unnecessarily, because it's going to introduce a lot of stress to the colonies. You don't want to go in there too often or disrupt them too much each time you go in there. You don't want to move them around too much from apiary to apiary. So just various ways to maintain the stress levels low, because as we know, with stress levels high, their immune system starts to go down, and then they get to fall prey to some of the pests and pathogens. So what you want to do also is to keep strong colonies, and all that is linked to what I've just talked about. But also keep in mind that all beekeeping is local, and it's all about location, location, location. And also a small amount of that is about genetics as well. So keep strong colonies with lots of bees able to protect their resources, and a healthy laying queen that's efficient, and so on and so forth. The last point in that stage is the good environment, to maintain a good environment. Again, just kind of making sure that they are not stressed out by predators, by weather, and if they need any kind of intervention, like emergency feeding for any reason, then you might want to consider that as well. So the importance of foundationless and natural wax. Bees build naturally on wax, not on plastic. And that's because that's the medium that they use to grow their brood into and store their food. And that's the most convenient way to do that. It also acts as a sponge for toxins and will remove from the brood or food toxic levels of pesticides or other things. But then that means it's going to accumulate in there, which is why we're going to want to rotate it out and cull it as we rotate them out. The wax also holds history and memory via the storage of up to 300 different chemical components in pheromones. So those are considered chemical signals, and the wax stores those. The other thing, and that's again related directly to the foundation versus foundationless, is that the honeybees, the wax combs have a resonant frequency that matches the bees' vibration sensors. So it basically acts as an information highway, and to be the most efficient possible, it needs to be loose and free to vibrate the way it needs to for them to transfer their messages, which cannot happen when you have plastic foundation that's rigid. It's a little bit easier with wax foundation, but keep in mind that for wax foundation, a lot of that is heavily contaminated by harsh chemicals, toxic chemicals, because it comes from commercial beekeepers. So after the cultural controls and sanitation, the third level is the physical and mechanical intervention. And that means things like implementing implements and practices that mechanically prevent or trap pests to minimize their base population. So basically things like you need to have equipment that's in good physical repair. if it's got gaps or crevices or hiding places or wide open door to the elements, then that's going to cause problems with pests and pathogens and generally the immune system and the strength of the colony. It's going to create inefficiencies. The other thing that you can do is use rough cut wood for the inside of your hives, especially if you're doing top bar hives or making your own boxes, because that's going to allow the honeybees to propolize those surfaces a lot easier. And that in turn is going to strengthen their immune system. The propolis is basically in effect their immune system. Another thing you can do is keep smaller entrances. That's the way the bees prefer in nature, and it has a purpose of allowing them to better defend their entrances and better control their airflows and temperatures throughout the colonies. They're master climate controllers, basically. And when we feel hot because it's hot for us and we leave a screen bottom board or the wide entrance and then put a shim at the top and let the airflow, we're preventing them from controlling it very tightly, and it has a negative impact. So it's better to keep smaller entrances as much as the traffic will allow. Now, of course, if you got a traffic jam, just open up the entrances a little bit more to increase efficiency. But as much as possible, keep just enough of an entrance for them to manage their traffic and their airflows. Another implement that helps at this level is anything that's a mechanical trap, such as the oil mineral traps for the small hive beetles, for example. Another barrier would be something like in the life cycle of the small hive beetle, where they go and pupate into the ground, you can use something like very fine crushed limestone under the beehive, and the larvae coming down to get into the ground will get all cut up, and that should interrupt their life cycle right there and minimize the reinfestation. Another thing that can be done mechanically is to allow the bees to grow their own drone, or in case of a Langstroth, to provide them with a drone frame that it can build on and lay drone into. And that means you can also remove it easily. So that's drone trapping and then culling it out of the colony, because those are going to be the highest levels of Varroa mites. They prefer the bigger drones because that gives them more time to develop more daughters, and there's also more space in the cells. So trapping and culling helps with the Varroa mites. The other thing you can do physically, mechanically, to intervene is to apply powder sugar to the bees and then let them groom themselves. That usually triggers a fall of mites. And if you have a sticky board underneath a screen bottom board, that's going to catch those falling mites and prevent them from going back up onto the bees. Barriers to robbing, for example, or mouse guards, things like that are physical and mechanical interventions that are going to reduce the incidences of pests or predators coming into the hive. Your wasps are not going to be able to come in if your entrances are all reduced through a barrier, or they're not going to be able to rob, or other colonies are not going to be able to rob them if there's a robber screen in place. For while that level recommended the use of screen bottom boards, which is 1/8 inch mesh screen under the floor of the hive, that's and nothing else, versus a solid bottom board. We don't recommend those, and they've fallen out of favor, actually. The idea was that they were allowing Varroa mites to fall through and for the colony to shed some level of infestation that way. However, the trade-off is not worth it, because there's only so much percentage of mice that are lost in that process, but there's definitely a lot more small hive beetles being able to go through the mesh at a smaller size, and it's kind of a wide door wide open. The bees are not able to control tightly their level of humidity and their temperatures and their pheromone atmosphere, because that's wide open at the bottom. The bees get confused and tend to gather underneath, and even sometimes build comb underneath. And what else? The benefits are only marginal and are more than compensated by the negative effects. So we don't recommend those at all. We definitely recommend solid bottom boards instead, in a way, as a kind of a mechanical intervention in itself, by closing the floor of the hive. So this is just kind of a picture to show you that if your equipment looks bad and it's got full of cracks and crevices, that's not a good beekeeping practices. So far, if you've seen, I've been having the green light, and we use various tactics in those 3 levels. However, this is where we stop. We're not going to go to the next level. That is, as you can see, that red light. We're not going to go to the level of number 4, which is the biological. In this case, it's not so much because the biological interventions are bad for the honeybee colonies. It's just that they're not very effective and scalable. And why is that? That's because the biological level of the IPM pyramid consists of predators, parasitoids, and pathogens of the pests that are infecting the colonies, such as entomopathogenic fungi or microbes that basically are going to kill the pests or pathogens. Nematodes, which is, this one is a nematode, a picture of a nematode, that are going to be, the nematodes are for the, I think it's Nosema, I forget. Apologies, but it's going to be one of those biological controls. The califers are the pseudoscorpions. They're definitely pests of the mites that are pests of the honeybees. So that's been proven. And then the bacillus also come into play and serve as a biological control of some of those pests and pathogens. Again, however, their efficacy is low, and more studies are needed for them to show how much benefit they bring. But in general, they are either not sustainable, you have to keep reapplying them, like in the case of the nematodes, or you don't have enough quantities of pseudoscorpions to take care of the issues. So they're hard to implement, and they're not necessarily very effective at the levels that we know how to use them at this point. So I don't usually, we stop before that because that's not practical otherwise. The next step over is number 5, and it's going to be chemicals, chemical intervention. And that's where it becomes actually toxic. It's no longer inert. It's actively toxic to the honeybee colonies, and it's going to have a negative impact on them. So this is going to be a huge trade-off. And at some point, you got to ask yourself if it's worth it, because, and I'll tell you why in a second. But chemicals, chemical intervention includes, and that's something that people don't always realize, is that it also includes the soft chemicals. And what are the soft chemicals? They're the essential oils, like the thymol, such as the one that's being used in Apiguard or Apilav var. Those are treatments that are based on essential oils, but they are also considered as soft chemicals. Honeybee Healthy is also considered as a chemical because it's an essential oil-based product. And these, the organic acids, in particular the formic acids with the Mite Away quick strips, the MAX, or the Formic Pro or the formic acid, are 3 different forms of formic acid products, the oxalic acid is an organic acid, and as such is a soft chemical. It's, some people like to call it an organic treatment because it's an organic acid and it's a treatment, but really in reality it's a soft chemical, and it has toxic consequences on the colony as well. HopGuard, its hop beta acids, is also an organic acid and as such a soft chemical, and it should be under that. Synthetic chemicals, things like the heavy duty medicated chemicals that were used heavily until recently, and that have contaminated the wax of a lot of commercial equipment and commercially produced wax, like Apivar, Apiston, Checkmate Plus. And then the antibiotics are also at this level with termicin and fumagillin, which are used for things like, I think, nosema and things like that. So the level 5 chemical control includes a bunch of different products, and this is just kind of a short list of them. Again, like Dr. Paracelsus, for those of you who think that wood bleach is inoffensive because it's found into the beehive in natural, in honey and things like that, yes, it is, but in such concentration that it's much, much lower than when it's applied as a chemical treatment. And basically, if you will, the analogy I could provide is that I don't mind putting some vinegar in my salad dressing, and I'll absorb it and I will be fine. However, I will not take a shower with hyper concentrated vinegar that's at 100, 95% proof of vinegar, because that's going to rip my skin and it's going to do mechanical damage to my body. Which is kind of why, by the way, beekeepers that are applying those products, first of all, they need a battery or some way to power the wands to affect the fumigation of the wood bleach crystals. But on top of that, they need some heavy duty respirators and heavy duty skin covering so that they don't get burned. And if you breathe any of that stuff in, you can actually die, or in effect calcify, turn your lungs into stone, and just have long life consequences and health problems because of it. So that's a really dangerous product. And in all of these have negative consequences as well. But here in this case, the oxalic acid will have also direct kills. It has been known to burn entire colonies because wax, guess what, is highly flammable, and you're putting a wand that you're heating up to sublimate a product to high temperatures. But it's also, all treatments are toxic to honeybees to a certain level. There's always a trade-off. It doesn't come for free. So usually it will be considered to be worth it when there's a drop in the pests and pathogens or the impact that they have on the colony, but there's always a cost. There's also, excuse me, a stress factor and a toxic factor, and that's going to cause things like queen events or toxic lethal problems with the brood or with the adults. So we highly recommend you don't flip the IPM pyramid on its head. It needs to stay vertical with a large base at the bottom and not getting flipped, and use chemicals as a first line of action or a prophylactic line of action that's systematically applied on a schedule. That's not the way that the IPM pyramid, and I think about 90% of beekeepers do it that way. And that's a misunderstanding of the IPM pyramid, and it's costing our bees a lot of stress and a lot of problems. So yes, if the more you stay below that line, and the further to the base, to the bottom of that pyramid you are, the more involved you are as a beekeeper, because you need to educate yourself better. You need to understand the pests and pathogens and their life cycles better. You need to be able to better identify their signs. You also need to be able to understand cultural control and requeen when you need to, making sure that you have uh, healthy colonies based on the, the the genetics, the right genetics, and the right well-mated queen. You have to be able to see if she's well-mated by the way she lays. You also need to intervene physically and mechanically, making sure that you stop the pests and pathogens from getting worse. So that's more work from you. Now, if you get past these 3 levels, that's less work to just kind of dump some chemicals into the hive and go and walk away and not worry about the pests and pathogens, understanding them and all the signs and the cultural controls. But it doesn't really work. And in the end, that heightened level of intervention increases also the bee stress. So the best thing you can do is to actually prevent problems from happening by staying at the bottom of the pyramid as much as possible. Otherwise, if you go above that line, it's going to be toxic to your colony. There's going to be a cost, and the trade-off is, in our opinion, not worth it at all. So prevention is the operative word here. There you go. So don't flip that pyramid. Keep it upside up, and don't flip it upside down like this by starting with chemical and application. You just don't want to flip it on its head. That's just not acceptable, and to do it that way. And the additional consideration I would ask you to ponder on is that to ponder is that when you do have to intervene at this level, you're actually propping up genetics that are not able to take care of themselves on their own, and that are susceptible to the pests and pathogens, and are weak compared to the pests and pathogens that are stronger. And by treating, you're actually even strengthening those pests and pathogens and putting additional pressure, evolutionary pressure, for them to develop even more resistance to products that should keep them in check. So it's not worth it on many levels. And in addition, you need to keep in mind that that trade-off is not free. All the chemical interventions have a negative effect on the colony bees, on the honeybee colonies. And first of all, there's a complexity of application. You should be rotating through several treatments to prevent resistance from setting in. And then that means you need to invest into several types of treatments. You need to understand how and when to apply them. Some of them are very tight guidelines of temperatures. And if you fall out of them, either that's not going to be efficient, or you're going to kill your bees, or make them leave, or an abscond. A lot of times there's queen events. It negatively impacts the fertility and the longevity of the queen or the drones. It has adult kills, brood kills, and sublethal effects that are not really obvious, that you need to keep in mind and take into account. In addition, their efficacy is not necessarily very big. You don't get a lot more winter survival than you would if you were applying the first 3 step of the pyramid. You actually get healthier bees when you do that. Things like impaired queen reproduction, increased brood mortality, brood development, reduced drone sperm quality. By the way, if you have a lot of treated colonies around, that means your drones are going to be most likely treated as well, and they're going to mate with your queens, and that's going to be a problem as well. Sublethal effects. So there's all kinds of reasons why those have a negative impact, and there's risks associated with them. And in our opinion, it's not worth it, because you can do a lot better if you're informed and trained and in tune with your bees and doing the right thing by keeping local resilient survivor stock for starters and good well-mated queens second. In effect, I mean, how can we even think that whatever is bad for the mites, which is, pests of the honeybees in insects, that it's going to be good for the bees? It's kind of hard to conceptualize if you think about it. So what about those organic treatments that we talked about, those soft chemicals? I'm sorry, the organic acids, those organic treatments. Well, Dr. Paracelsus, he's the father of toxicology, and he said it best. Basically, it's the dose that makes the poison. Remember that example of the vinegar in my salad dressing versus the 95% concentrated shower of vinegar that would melt my body? That's kind of like the analogy here. And on top of that, for any one hive that was treated and survived, there's another that was treated and didn't survive. Treating is not a silver bullet, and it's not necessarily going to save a colony, especially if it's a weak colony with weak genetics and other underlying problems. So it's not the solution necessarily. And then there's also, for each of those, a hive that has recovered from a level of pest and pathogen infestation and survived naturally. My friend Brittany, she's a remover, and she says that sometimes she's got wax moth issues and she keeps killing them, and then the colony just recovers from that. She hasn't at any point treated for anything, but by providing, minimizing the other stressors in the colony, such as poor nutrition or, poor sanitation or all kinds of other stressors, by minimizing those and trying to strengthen that colonies, very often those pests and pathogens take care of themselves. Impact on the overwintering colony loss. That's from data from the Tools for Varroa Management from the Honeybee Health Coalition. I recommend you read it, and you realize that the efficacy is listed in there for overwintering survival rates is not very, high compared to the cost and the stress that it causes the bees to use those treatments. So there's anywhere from no impact whatsoever on the overwintering colony loss up to about 30 to 40%, I think, max. And so that's not a huge improvement compared to the negative impact that these may have on the colony. And most of them, the best impact on overwintering colony improvements was when requeening using resilient stock, local survivor stock. So there's a theme here, and that's still the first level of the IPM pyramid. And what happens though, if we use chemical treatments or organic treatments and chemical treatments, is that over time, our bees are weaker and weaker. If you keep propagating, it's not so much that you're saving this one colony by treating it, it's that you're propping up weaker genetics that are going to reproduce. And those offsprings are not going to be genetically necessarily very strong. So you're propagating the problem. Whereas if you raise your bees without treatments, over time, that produces hardier and hardier bees. And for those who say that we're not there yet, that's not true. I've been keeping bees for 6 years. I've not lost myself a single colony to mite infestations. I have lost some to a queen failing to return and not being there to notice it. I've lost, usually it's my fault. And it's more mechanical than it is anything else, or because I haven't intervened early enough. But I haven't had, the only one time I lost a colony to parasitic mite syndrome, and that was from buying bees, two nukes from a reputable provider in our area. And when I got the nuke, I could tell right there and I mentioned it, but it's kind of, beekeepers get very sensitive about this kind of stuff. So I didn't insist, but it was clearly, it came to me with parasitic mite syndrome. It was clear as day. And sure enough, they didn't make it a week or 10 days after that. And that was not because of me. That's because it came with poor genetics, or that colony was not, there was no intervention on time to fix the underlying issues. The other thing is that treating with bees with chemicals or organic acids helps weaker genetic to propagate. That's what I was talking about, and allows also the strongest mites to breed even stronger mites. There's signs of resistance even to some of the organic acids that are starting to be observed. So food for thoughts is that. What about the Varroa mite bombs? People like to talk about those. That concept has been pushed. I'm not going to get into the polemic of that, but there's a lot of politics going into the battles between treating and not treating, and Varroa mite bombs and things like that. And in particular, what you have to keep in mind is that a lot of the research out there has been funded by the chemical companies that stand the most to sell those treatments to beekeepers and to keep them under treatment treadmill, so to speak. A lot of the research is also done by universities whose funding depends on those pesticide companies. And also the fact that they are given colonies of bees, or are using bees that are not very good, in particular a lot of Italians in poor health that have been treated, that are not strong genetics, and they're trying to do experiments and research using that kind of bees. Obviously, those are not the ones that we recommend for a successful beekeeping experience when using the first 3 levels of the IPM pyramid. And then lastly, they are doing lab observations in vacuum from the superorganism, and it's hardly representative of what happens in real life in such complex organisms in the field. So keep that in mind. The other thing that I would like to add is that so the mite bomb terminology is a myth that was meant to be, dramatic. And while I don't like that terminology because I don't think it represents reality, I play sometimes and use the term treated drones bomb. And what I mean by that is that in our neck of the woods, we don't have a lot of treated colonies, which makes it a lot easier for us to keep healthy, non-treated, treatment-free colonies, because the drones that are mating with our queens are also non-treated. In areas that have a lot of treated drones, you end up with your queens mating with a lot of treated drones that are going to contribute a disproportionate amount of non-viable or poor sperm to their spermatheca, which is going to in turn, no matter how good your queen was, is going to make a poorly mated queen out of her, and her offsprings are not going to have the best genetic set of genetics. And so that's going to negatively impact your colony because you have too many treated drones. That's why I'm kind of tongue-in-cheek. I created that terms of treated drones bombs because I think that's a bigger problem, much bigger problem than the mite bombs that beekeepers talk about. So in conclusion, I would say that it's a good idea to have a toolkit of best practices to prevent and address most issues. And for that, I would go back through the first 3 steps of the IPM pyramid at the beginning of this presentation and kind of make a note of what those are. In addition, I would say it would behoove us to humbly open our hearts and mind to the wisdom of the hive. They've been, successful at thriving for millions of years, and yes, they've been thrown a curveball, but they are plenty of sign that plenty of colonies have learned to either tolerate the Varroa mites in particular, and the virus that they transmit. They've become more and more resistant, especially if they're in healthy, strong, condition, the key is to stack the decks. Natural comb, well-fed queens that are well-bred, that were allowed to lay for a couple of weeks before they were dispatched, local survivor resilient stock, good nutrition. If you multiply all these, you're stacking the decks, and then it becomes hard for the pests and pathogens to take hold. Whereas if you use the chemicals and the organic acids, you're basically propping up weaker genetics and stronger mites, basically. So, and stronger pathogens and pests. So it will behoove us to let the bees teach us what works and what doesn't, rather than thinking that we know better than the bees. And that's kind of an arrogant way to approach our interventions. And the other thing is to respect their free will and processes as much as we can. We should not be intervening as much as we do. We should keep them, when you go in a beehive every day or every week, you're going in too much, you're going to be stressing them, and they're going to take away a lot of the work that they've done. Whereas if you space those out and don't spend as much time in the colony, for example, that helps a lot. If you are respecting their natural instinct for swarming, you're going to allow them to be healthier. You can leverage that to make splits, for example. But those brood breaks and those splittings, yes, you're going to have a little bit of a trade-off on the honey, not as much as people like to say, by the way, but you're going to have a lot healthier colonies, and that's the natural way of things with the honeybees. So it's good to respect that free will and processes. And just having an understanding that every single one of our interruptions disrupts them and stresses their natural order, which takes a toll on their immune system and the overall colony health, is important to remember as well. So in summary, I would say that it would behoove us to have the serenity to accept the things that we cannot change, the courage to change the things that we can in a respectful and mindful, and I would say timely way, and the humility to know the difference. Beekeepers are often way too arrogant and think that they know better than the bees, where things go a lot easier and a lot better if you follow the lead of the bees. And that's good for the bees and for the beekeeping community as well, because you have healthier and stronger colonies that way. So if you have any questions about this, just contact us. We are at bee-mindful.com. And our email again is beemindfulhoneyfarms@gmail.com. We do apiary tours. We have one of the largest teaching apiaries. It's got all kinds of hives, from Warre hives to Tabar hives, Langstroth hives, Leghorns hives. We have a slow flow hive. We have, what else? Long Langs. And we're working on the AZ hive. And I've got a natural tree hive that from a cutout from a 4-step sconce. So it's a cavity that I'm taking home and I'm going to set up bees in. And so we teach, and we're able to speak to all types of beehives and the way to manage them. And the one that's really our favorite and we recommend to all of our beekeepers is the horizontal Tabar hives, because they're the least impactful and the most practical. It's a good trade-off for the beekeepers and the bees, and keeps them really healthy, low stress, easy to manage, especially in the horizontal plane. And you can host 2 colonies in the one Tabar hive. This is a fancy one, by the way. We have some simpler ones, but there's also, if you're interested in those, we have them on our website for sale. And you can come to our double Tabar hive making workshop with Les Crowder mid-November, and you'll get to go home with one of the budget Tabar hives, double Tabar hives, just in time for the holiday season. And you'll spend, I think it's 4 hours with Les learning how to make them, assemble them, and manage them, as well as you'll have a good dose of Les Crowder's beekeeping philosophy and words of wisdom and words of wisdoms. And he's got a lot of those, and he's very inspiring. Again, I recommend you take a look at the Top Bar Beekeeping book, Organic Practices for Honeybee Health. And keep in mind that that can apply to any kind of hive. It's also a beekeeping philosophy and a way to approach honeybee colonies in a mindful way. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to contact us. And that's the end of my presentation. And I hope that you enjoy this. You give natural beekeeping a try based on the principles of integrated pest management. That's actually where it starts. And together we can do this, and we can minimize the impact of all the pesticides and stressors on the colonies. There's plenty out there in the crops and fields. They don't need to get that into their homes. I think that's it. Any questions you have about any kind of beehives, we can help you. We do a chat with the mindful beekeepers every Thursday from 5 p.m. Central Standard Time to 6 p.m. On Zoom and on Instagram. And you can find that information on the Be Mindful LLC Facebook page, or by following us on Instagram. Questions, let us know. We'll be happy to help. You have a good day. Thank you.